Hello and welcome back to Ye Olde Guide. Today we have a special episode. Following our episode a few months back on the origins of towns in England, we want to take you through the next stages in the evolution of urban life through the medieval period. And this is a pivotal period in the development of towns and cities in England, and it's really left a legacy still visible today in urban cores that exist in our own time, but not always. Many of the towns that were very important in the medieval period are not the same ones that are important now, but more of that later. I'm Liam McGrath, and I'm delighted to introduce historian Daniel Gooch. Daniel, can you set the scene of what you'll be covering today?
This episode, it follows on chronologically from our previous special on the origins of English urban life. At that point, we stopped roughly at the Norman conquest, and we're carrying on from there today. We'd love you to listen to that episode first, but you certainly don't need to in order to enjoy this one if you just happen to come upon this one. We'll be looking at English towns today in the period, as we said, from about 1066 to about 1500. This was an exciting period of urban growth, but really before town populations and social structures became more stable as they did later. We're going to jump around a bit across these 4.5 centuries, but we'll probably lean a bit more towards the latter part of the timescale, just to emphasise the differences between urban life then and when we left off in the Origins episode. We'll mainly, but definitely not exclusively, be looking at kind of the 20 to 30 biggest towns in the country at any time. Though, as usual for this guide, we're not going to be including London very much in our analysis. London, as we always say, is really a topic unto itself. We'll tackle that separately at some point. It was many times bigger than all the other cities during this period. Its scale, its urban structures were just completely different from provincial towns. The broad structure is, first, we'll be giving a bit of the political context and the general trends of urban development at this time. Second, maybe the slightly more fun bit, covering what these towns and cities were actually like, how they were built, how they looked, what they contained, the sights and the smells that you would get in them.
And you won't be surprised to hear, Daniel, I can't wait to hear the numbers. Which were the biggest towns? So you've said you want to start from 1066. Why was 1066 such an important change in this period of British history?
Really because the Norman conquest just brought so much more stability and security to the country. This allowed, for our purposes, it's important because it allowed more resources to be put into urban development. The Norman conquest increased European trade links for English towns. It strengthened central government, and the now diminished threat of invasion from overseas, including importantly the subdued Vikings who'd been defeated just before the Battle of Hastings, made towns more secure. And this meant that new towns could be introduced, and not just by the king, but by new Norman lords who'd been introduced onto the land to kind of replace the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy to a great extent. One of the immediate consequences of this period for the physical fabric of towns was in the really extensive construction of castles, which not only meant the settlements were where central royal authority could be exerted, but they also provided kind of a physical and commercial focus for towns. Early post-conquest towns were often centred around major institutions of the town, like the cathedral or castle, who would be not just the major providers of security in the case of the castle, but also the major consumers. They would consume the goods produced in the towns, and therefore they would be sources of trade for the town that grew around it. A good way to think of this is towns essentially growing up to service the castle or the cathedral. A good example we covered recently was Peterborough, which grew around the cathedral around this time. This did change a bit later as the urban markets shifted further towards the edge of towns in many places. They shifted more towards approaching roads, which helped towns develop external trade links. As the historian Grenville Astle points out, this meant that the major economic consumers for towns moved from your local bigwigs in the castles and the cathedrals to the wider rural population and beyond. Astle also points out that the reason Winchester, to give a good example, the former Saxon capital, fell so dramatically from prominence was because after it ceased to be a royal residence where the local bigwig was consuming everything, the rural economy surrounding Winchester just wasn't large or diverse enough to support it. That's why Winchester, it's still there, but it's nowhere near as relatively important as it used to be. In other words, Once royalty stopped funding the city's trade, no one else stepped in to fill that gap and buy stuff from Winchester.
So focus is turned to cathedrals and castles. Now, another phenomenon of this era was, for the first time since the Romans, I suppose, we have the phenomenon of planned towns.
We do. We've hinted a bit at this already, but one of the most important consequences of the Norman conquest for urban life in the UK was the widespread construction of new towns. I know this is a concept we associate probably more with 20th century developments, but the Normans created hundreds of new towns, or plantations as they're also known, in the centuries after 1066. Estimates vary, but one source suggests that 256 new towns were created in England and Wales in the Middle Ages, with 90% of these established in the first couple of centuries after the conquest by 1350. Most of these new planned towns, as we said, were created quite early, and there was always a clear political angle to this early construction. Not only were castles built to exert control over a particular area, but the early planning and construction was part of the process of replacing the previous established Anglo-Saxon elites, not least as many of the planted new towns were built not just by the king, but by the newly introduced Norman nobility who replaced them. There's also quite a bit of variation in the layout of these early post-conquest new towns. Eric Wood, to illustrate the point, compares the grid layout of medieval Bury St Edmunds with its, even today, obvious grid pattern in the streets next to the cathedral. You can still see it there, with the streetscape of Launceston, which grew in an oval pattern around the castle. It's very, very different. They're both early Norman planned towns. Many of the later planned towns were constructed under the reign of Edward I, who was a great builder of new towns. He took a personal interest in their construction. He held a colloquium, which is a bit like a conference or a parliament in Harwich in 1297, dedicated specifically to the topic of town planning. A parliament on town planning sounds right up your street, Liam, I've got to say.
I have to agree. I would have loved that.
Edward had three main town planners working for him. He drew on existing plans from France, from constructions that had been made there. He was so committed to this because his political and military troubles on multiple fronts meant he needed to set up new settlements in important strategic locations. Edward, remember, was the hammer of the Scots. He was the conqueror of Wales. He was at war on multiple fronts. His Welsh cities, with their magnificent castles, are the most obvious, you might say, to some eyes garish, but certainly magnificent, brilliant examples of how his urban plantations met that need. But Berwick upon Tweed on the Scottish border is another outside Wales. Now, it's been observed that Edward's new towns, this second generation of Norman plantations, were, if you leave perhaps the castles aside, a bit more homogenous in their design than earlier ones. This probably comes back to that point that he was working efficiently with town planners. He was importing template ideas efficiently from French towns, not just starting from scratch.
I find it absolutely fascinating that we've got this level of planning at such a high level, at such a senior level, at this era in our history. Could you give me more of a sense of what these planned towns looked like?
Yep, certainly. And on that point, Edward used to visit these towns as well. New Winchelsea is an example of where he would actually visit the city and take a personal interest in its construction. But yeah, certainly, what were they like? Planned towns would usually adapt to existing features, like castles or old roads. They might be adaptive of existing settlements. They might be set around one or more central features, like the castle, the marketplace. But there are also linear setups. What we mean by that is towns growing along one single road. Think of kind of one main high street with the buildings growing alongside it, rather than this square or rectangular or oval grid pattern. And these were more common for market towns than grid patterns, especially later, when the concept of defence, the need for defence, became less important. If you want a good example of a linear medieval city along that one single road, Chipping Campden is a very good one, though the grids are probably more recognisable remnants to us today. The classic medieval street had burgage plots on each side, strips of rented land. Usually you get a house and a long and narrow stretch of unbuilt land behind it on each side. Many still exist today. There are many good examples in a modern setting of how burgage plots still are surviving today in the ownership and the division of the land. Reading is a good example. We covered that long ago in our Reading episode. And also Low Petergate in York has this long strip of burgage plots coming off that road.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned that there were these different structures of Newtown, because I must admit, when you started talking about it, I was thinking of that new Winchelsea grid layout that was built because the old town was swept away in a storm, and you've got you've got this very visible grid layout, and it's obviously a new town. It's tiny by modern standards, but so we had this period of relatively large urban development for its time. What were the impacts of the Black Death? Because obviously this had a big impact on population and particularly urban population. So what's the impact there?
Substantial. There is no question that the Black Death caused serious decline in many towns. Urban populations fell by about a third, not atypical for a European country, but certainly in a British context, very, very high. This meant that in most towns, you would just have fewer people, fewer shops, in many cases, real decay around the edges of towns, though it did mean that some houses became larger because you would fill the spaces that were left vacant. The Black Death also stalled future urban growth in many places. There's very little evidence of housing construction in the aftermath of the Black Death in lots of cities. York is one example. You just don't get that kind of construction like you were in the years before. More broadly in this period, Jennifer Commody's written about this, says that most regional centre towns that were kind of at the centre of a region, saw recession after about 1400 due to external economic factors like changes in trade routes and overseas markets and London's growing dominance. But it is a mixed bag. A few towns saw their population and wealth remain stable. Norwich is a particular example of a city that, moving on from the time after the Black Death, saw its prosperity peak in the late Middle Ages. Ludlow is an example of a later medieval town that did well through success in the textile trade. Much of the building from this period still remains. And Commode also notes that high mortality rates after the Black Death led to more skilled employment opportunities for women in some cities like York. So, yeah, generally disastrous for many, many places, but there is a bit of a mixture to it.
I must admit, I like this idea of houses expanding because the person next door has died in the Black Death. Just take their land off them.
Not so simple today, I don't think.
Not so simple today.
Your property rights then.
So, right, my favourite bit. This is where I'm really interested. I want to know which were the most important towns and cities in this era. Give me the approximate rankings if you can.
Oh, we do have some empirical basis to rank the top few. The Cambridge Urban History of Britain ranks Bristol, Lincoln, Norwich and York as the top ranking towns based on tax records, how much tax was collected there. We also see a notable drop for Dunwich, the famous Suffolk East Coast town, which went from being a hugely important trading port to being basically nothing today, a small village of a couple of hundred people. It went from being in the kind of the second ranking group is how they're positioning it, to the sixth division from so from the second ranking group in 1154 to the sixth division by 1312, very, very quickly. This is basically relegation from the Championship to the Conference South, if that's a good way of putting it. So there was some movement there.
Football analogy, inevitable there. And just a reminder, we are excluding London because obviously if we were including London, it would always be the number one by miles. But yes, I was expecting Norwich, Bristol, York, absolutely. But yes, Dunwich. I mean, there's not a lot left of Dunwich.
No, there's not. We are going to cover Dunwich a little bit in a later special, but you're right. It was a hugely important town. It's unique because there are very few which dropped so dramatically in this town, really because of coastal erosion, silting up of the estuary, and the town getting abandoned. But we'll save more detail on that for the next special because I am looking forward to talking about Dunwich in more detail. Talking a bit more about the largest towns. So those are the top ranking ones in 1312 by that measure. In 1354, there's a taxability survey which is similar, but this time this has put Newcastle and Boston above Norwich, while Lincoln has moved down from the top 4 to 9th. Poll tax records at this time show there were most taxpayers in London, of course, followed by York, Bristol, Coventry, Norwich and Lincoln. So there's a bit of variation depending on what measure you're using, but some consistency there. looking a bit further ahead, Jennifer Commode again, she identifies about 20 towns as important provincial centres, as she's labelling them, in 1377, based on the number of taxpayers, size, extent of building, appearance, extent of their social structures, sophistication of government, and importance in their region. It's quite interesting, I think, to look at the background of most of these important towns, how they were established. Some were on important command posts for Vikings or Romans. Most were near or on a Roman road or settlement, and most were Saxon towns. While there were some newish towns, and many in the east particularly grew as ports based on tiny settlements in the area, and some were kind of new, in inverted commas, new towns established by the Normans, Salisbury was the only one planted, or in this case refounded, in a completely and totally undeveloped area, having been moved from Old Sarum, Old Salisbury, to the present location.
It's remarkable to think that Salisbury is a replanted town, like a new town. Remarkable to think that today when you visit.
You can still see the central grid pattern in the middle of Salisbury. Unlike New Winchelsea is interesting because it's just the grid. It never grew any further. Whereas Salisbury, you've still got the grid pattern, but so much has grown around it, it can get lost amidst that and all the building. But like with Bury St Edmunds, the same thing's happened. It's there. That central new plantation medieval core is there. You just have to look for it.
Yeah, and it's obvious once someone points it out. So you've mentioned the biggest towns by rank, but how big were these places? What kind of populations and importance were these places? Unlike
today, towns were not major centres of population. The vast majority of the country at that time lived rurally. Ian Mortimer estimates that 12% of the population in the 14th century lived in towns of any size, large or small. He includes smaller market towns in this. By 1400, Barry Dobson estimates that around 10% of the population lived in larger towns of over 2,000 people. So, not many people at all living there. Cities weren't that big either. Populations, aside from London, didn't generally go above 10,000. Some historians argue that there may have been an underestimate of populations in cities, but still, they were very, very low by modern standards. It seems more people lived in smaller towns, in areas smaller than towns, like villages, which supports Barry Dobson's conclusion that urbanisation in medieval England was much more widely dispersed and less concentrated in much of Europe, where you would get far more people living in a smaller number of bigger cities in many cases.
And how important were these towns economically and politically?
Well, the small size definitely doesn't mean that medieval towns were isolated communities or that rural people didn't spend extensive time in them. They were important places that people in the rural surrounding communities would go to, because the most important economic function of small towns was in general to act as a market centre, not just for its own, but also the surrounding populations. People needed to buy and sell things. They weren't able to travel long distances to large commercial cities, and this meant that most towns would have a market. And this means that there were many people who came into the city during the day to work and trade. So even if you didn't live in the town, there were still loads of people who would have regular or occasional contact with towns, visit the towns for economic reasons. Ian Mortimer, again, he says that daytime populations could be about 2 or 3 times higher than nighttime ones. If you had a major fair going on, it could be even higher than that. More broadly, it's probably worth noting that populations were highly volatile in the Middle Ages, and I think populations could be quite variable in the short term too. Pilgrims, cathedral cities, trades, markets and fairs could temporarily increase a city's population, similar to kind of what you might get somewhere like Brighton or any other seaside town today during the holiday season. On a political level, towns had some political power, but really on a local or a regional basis. The most important function of town councils and burgesses was to control the food supply. They might regulate prices and quality with regulation enforced by local courts, or even act on these things indirectly by allowing more traders in order to increase competition. Civic authorities were more concerned with providing amenities than any kind of formal architectural planning, though there were some building regulations in place from the 13th century onwards. These were aimed at fire prevention and aesthetics. Some cities, for example, they would dictate the height of party walls, and they would state that roofing materials had to be fireproof as fire prevention measures. And office holders, local political office holders, were very often merchants, and the authorities often acted alongside guilds, who were professional associations of people carrying on the same trade, which might control quality, quantity of people who could trade, and the training that people would have. Towns would have had charters giving them certain political rights, and in some cases they did have a degree of regional autonomy. Chester, for instance, was made a palatinate earldom in 1071, meaning it had some independence of royal government throughout the Middle Ages. But this was exceptional. As Jennifer Commode points out, although many towns did have distinct importance in their region, most had nothing like the level of autonomy or regional domination that many continental cities had. Local government, as we said, could regulate the lives of their citizens to some extent, the mayors and the councils, but they were always subordinate to royal authority. And I think the limits of local political authority were illustrated by their lack of influence, their lack of autonomy in times of war. Barry Dobson notes that financial contributions by civic authorities to royal military campaigns were less significant than those made on an individual basis by merchants, and that during periods of internal strife like the Wars of the Roses, most town councils were really keen just to retain neutrality than be led by ideology or loyalty to pick a side. It was about self-preservation rather than having the power to assert an ideology or pick a side or assert your will on anything.
So you've set out the economic and political power of these towns and cities, and you've talked a lot about the purpose economically for people coming into the city. And I think that brings us on really to what would have these places looked and felt like?
As you approached a town or city, I think churches, particularly cathedrals, would probably dominate the skyline from the first point you could see them and be the first thing you'd see. And cathedrals in particular at this time would be many, many times bigger than any other buildings around. We've talked in our Lincoln episode about how Lincoln Cathedral was the tallest building in the world for many centuries, but it was by no means unique in how much it would dominate the skyline. Really, because towns were so much more isolated back then, there would be less around to block the view from afar. Lots of churches had been constructed in many towns in the prior centuries, but in the 14th and 15th centuries, the number of urban churches was falling slowly in smaller towns, plus newer medieval towns had fewer churches, usually just one. An amazing example, if you want to see this, of a single church in a town comes in Long Melford in Suffolk at the colossal Holy Trinity Church built on the profits of the wool trade. As you got closer to the town, you might have gates, perhaps walls, or banks and ditches in most towns. There were notable exceptions of peaceful towns that never needed permanent defences. Reading is one of them. But many towns started to erect defences or gates in the late 12th century. This wasn't just for protection. It also defined the area of the town in ways which are still visible today. Walls continued to be built in the 14th century, notably those at Coventry, the unique brick walls in Hull, in Canterbury and Winchester. And the walls weren't just used for defence. They could also control trade and tariffs and lock out plague victims. There was also, though, a lot of building work up against walls, so they could, particularly from the inside, become obscured and maybe less distinct physical features as time passed. However, despite this physical delineation of the city limits that the walls gave you, you may also have had suburban growth along roads that led into the town. There was already suburban expansion in most large towns by 1300. And by the 16th century, as Jennifer Commode writes, some cities had a quarter or even as much as half of their population living in suburbs. Some people lived further out in the suburbs due to overcrowding, but also they lived there because space was needed for other purposes, or people just wanted a bit of freedom from being watched and regulated by the local authorities. Usually these suburbs were ribbon developments, meaning the suburban housing would stretch in long, thin lines, either side of roads stretching away from the city centre. Bootham in York is one very good example of a suburb outside the historic city centre, set up just outside the York city walls from the 13th century. It wasn't always a case of expansion, though. Cambridge Urban History again notes that before 1300, most meaningful urban buildings were large, think churches, other monastic buildings. But after 1350, buildings tended to be much smaller, and many cities which had the earlier grand buildings saw a bit of a decline in the built environment, and some areas were abandoned. In many cases, the smaller towns with fewer populated streets inhabited the same large area within previously built city walls. So you'd have this previously delineated area. In the Middle Ages, when you'd got the walls built, there were fewer people in there, fewer big buildings, much more sparsely populated and built on. There are some exceptions, though. Berwick upon Tweed, quite a late example of city walls being built, but they're actually rebuilt to encircle the shrunken urban area as it had become smaller from the previous walls. Not a universal trend, though. Some cities did expand their areas. Newcastle and Bristol expanded along reclaimed land on riverbanks, so there were exceptions. Now, in the town itself, most towns had probably recognisably the same features. You'd have street plans, marketplaces, burgage plots, churches, and commercial buildings. Most towns, it's been argued, differed only in size rather than in their fundamental nature. And there were undoubtedly many common features. Of the 23 important regional centres identified by Jennifer Commode in 1377, the greater towns, as she calls them, all had some form of town wall. This varied between your earthbanks, Roman, Saxon and medieval constructions. All had guildhalls, all had made religious houses. 22 had at least one school, 18 had castles, 18 had ports or rivers, and 14 or 15, it's not totally clear, may have been pre-conquest primary centres, i.e. were important before the Norman conquest. Most also had county courts. However, despite these common features, there was still some variety underpinning the town in its natural underpin. They usually had some kind of distinctive natural feature underlying the town, like a kind of base layer, as the reason for its location. You might have a hill, a river that offered natural protection or communication links. Some of these do still exist prominently. Think of that huge hill in Lincoln, which really does define the city, certainly the older core of the city. In others, they're less notable. You can think of London, where the land is flat now, and many of the rivers that once flowed through the city or the centre of the city are now hidden underground. You would often also in the Middle Ages find many rural features still sitting alongside the larger urban buildings inside cities. You might have small farms or animals even kept within the city confines. Most towns would have a main road running through as well. This seems like an obvious point, but like town centres today, the main roads were important nucleuses for buildings, like inns for travellers who were passing through on that road. A marketplace, as we've mentioned, was the commercial hub of a town. Medieval marketplaces were quite big. They were at least twice the size they are now in most cases, if they survive. And there were quite a lot that were growing in this time. Around 2,800 new markets were founded between 1200 and 1500, mostly in the 13th century. And thinking about what these marketplaces looked like beyond their size, they often had a distinctive feature of access from the corner. As Francis Pryor explains, this really helped funnel animals out of the area. It would often be bringing animals in, funneling them out through a corner was much, much easier. There were some facilities constructed, like market buildings, city gates to control access and warehouses. And more broadly, markets might lead to perhaps the supply of clean water, clean public water supplies, sometimes organised by civic authorities, sometimes by the church. Many merchants with properties around marketplaces would extend their shop frontages out. Lots of stall holders would leave their stalls out permanently, which eventually developed in many places into fixed market buildings. This is a tradition which survives in many places today, most famously the big covered market, the permanent covered market that's in the centre of Norwich, that dates back to the Middle Ages.
And that's a classic example. And marketplaces are now one of the big remaining distinguishing features of this era. And you've spoken about cathedrals and how the cathedrals would have dominated the skyline and just be relatively larger than the small-scale house that was built. What other major buildings, public buildings, would there have been in towns at this time?
Well, many cities had castles, of course, though by the end of the Middle Ages, these urban castles were nearly all remnants of the preceding centuries up to 1300. not always in the best condition. They were perhaps focused more on providing facilities than being purely defensive fortifications. Warwick Castle is a great example of a medieval urban castle that was central to the city and served a defensive purpose before it became just a home in later, more peaceful times. It was built in 1068, part of a series of post-conquest fortifications put up to contain northern England, which took longer to finally subdue. And it's by far the largest and most recognisable feature in the town of Warwick today. The original Norman castle motte at the back is a great example of the landscaping of an early, primarily military fortress, while the huge 14th century facade that looks over the river was built later, more as a statement of the owner's power and status, representing the changing purposes of these buildings at this time. So less for defence, more about projecting your own power and status. Beyond castles, you had guildhalls. Guildhalls were usually the main public buildings in towns. These first appeared in the 12th century. They had numerous diverse functions. They were courts, markets, kitchens, storage rooms. They might contain cells even. There are many medieval guildhalls still around. There are late timber-framed examples like the one in Lavenham in Suffolk, which I think is technically early Tudor, but is definitely worth mentioning and looking at. There are late stone versions at Norwich from 1413 and York from 1459. For earlier examples, I'll pick out in particular St Mary's Guildhall in Lincoln. This was built of stone in around 1160 to 1180, possibly as an early royal palace over the Roman Fosse Way, and you can still see parts of the way inside the building. For more modest buildings that the everyday person might use a bit more, you had taverns and inns in town as well. Taverns were commonly found underground in cellars from the early 14th century, but moved upstairs to the ground floor later in many cases. Inns, now these differed from taverns in that they were used for accommodation and meals as well as drinking, were more extensive. They're often built around a courtyard. You might have gallery buildings centered around this courtyard in the center. Quite a few of these survive. There is a great example in Gloucester, the 15th century New Inn, which was built as accommodation for pilgrims. There's also one that I think is one of your locals, the George in Southwark.
That's right. Famous for its galleries and courtyard.
Yep.
So exactly. So we've spoken about the large buildings, the cathedrals, castles, city walls, Guildhall. We always bring up Guildhalls in the oldie guide. Always an impressive building in any old city. What about the ordinary housing that people lived in? What was that like?
It tended to cluster around certain areas. In some cities, Jennifer Commode gives examples of Gloucester and Chester. People lived around the commercial centres. In other cities, they might be, say, near the water supply, if that was somewhere else, because of industrial and personal demands. Houses were usually made of local materials. For obvious reasons, they're easy to get. Commonly wood was used, sometimes stone, sometimes earth, sometimes bricks. And in some places, houses were built from reused materials from old buildings, including even Roman ones, which were still standing to some extent at the time. Poorer houses might be single-storey, wooden, perhaps divided into small rented rooms. Very few examples of poor urban houses survive in any form. They weren't usually built of stone. They were usually built along streets, and that means the remnants since then have been destroyed by street widening and other construction work in the centuries since. As for richer houses, archaeological evidence shows that stone was used commonly in their construction in the 13th and 14th centuries. Brick was being used a bit then too, particularly in Hull, which had one of the earliest brickworks in the country, but brick became a bit more common from maybe the 15th century onwards.
No, it's always easy to forget how old Hull is.
Mm-hmm.
Check out our episode on Hull if you haven't already. Now, the church had enormous influence at the time, and if you go to many of the cities you've mentioned, Norwich, York, a lot of buildings around the cathedrals, what was the influence of the church on these towns at the time?
Church, of course, was a major force in English society back then, and no less in towns, as well as owning many of the larger structures in towns like churches, cathedrals, and monastic buildings, which would have, as we said, have dominated the town's skylines and urban spaces. There were major property owners. For instance, Jennifer Commode again reports that the church owned 62% of Oxford rent income by 1312. Now, this was exceptionally high, but many other towns weren't that far behind. In 1455, the church owned 59% of the rent income in Gloucester, so hugely important landowners. And there was a lot of transformation of church property under the Normans, who rebuilt or modified most non-monastic church buildings. And most of those that still exist have themselves been extensively modified in the subsequent centuries. They also, in the 11th century, moved many cathedrals into towns from rural areas. There was really a consolidation of these, making sure they were in the high populated areas.
So what were these towns like to live in?
Overall, I think you could say they were, certainly by modern standards, insecure, dirty, and vulnerable to catastrophe or negative external events. I think it's fair to say they probably stank in most cases, probably worse than we could really conceive of today.
Yeah.
Numerous sources really emphasise the filth of medieval towns. The lack of sewage and sanitation meant that even in cities that were small by today's standards, you'd get rats, human waste and rubbish piling up, though the severity and the extent might depend on the particular town and the area within it. In some cases, servants were paid to clear the streets in the more prosperous areas. And by the 14th century, many of the most antisocial commercial activities like butchering and fishmongering were confined to specific areas of the city. Water would very often be polluted, though there were some early examples of basic sanitary authorities taking action, like in Exeter, where, and you might have to bleep this if you want to keep our universal rating, the Shitbrook in the 12th century transported what you might expect to the River Exe, which was later replaced by public toilets on an island in the river. People, let's be honest, were filthy too. They would have dirt all over them, dirty clothes, shoes and feet. There quite obviously wasn't the same ability to wash your clothes, wash yourself back then. There were very few public spaces. There were no parks. It was rare to have squares outside the marketplaces. So people would often just be socialising in the streets. And these streets very often weren't paved. You might be walking through dirty dust or mud, depending on the weather. However, it's probably fair to point out that many medieval town streets were quite wide, probably much wider than we would generally think of them as being. In many cases, surviving medieval streets, or streets that have the appearance of being medieval, have actually been narrowed by later frontages that have been put onto the buildings on each side. They wouldn't have been there before. You would have had a much wider street to look at. It's quite difficult for that reason to really appreciate how wide the streets were back then. But if you want to do this, there's a good example of Broad Street in Ludlow, a medieval street that has really retained its spacious width in comparison with others. Cities, as I said, were highly insecure and unsafe by today's standards due to numerous factors: lack of police, vulnerability to disease and famine, plus the huge risk of fire. Most buildings were made of wood, and fire provided so many needs: light, warmth and cooking. They weren't just a risk to personal safety, but they could completely alter a town. 40% of the houses in Norwich were destroyed by two fires in 1507 and 1508. So it's no wonder that authorities took some measures to try and at least regulate the safety of towns from a fire safety perspective.
Goodness me. I mean, it must have been incredibly difficult places to live, absolutely filthy. Mm-hmm. Animals everywhere, I suppose, as you're bringing animals to market. Small-scale industrial processes of the time, mm-hmm. from your own house probably, and just no standards of sanitation or hygiene. How did people survive? Who lived in these towns?
That's a very interesting question, actually. Many sources say it was actually newcomers, people who were new to the towns, predominantly because life expectancy was so low in these towns that, as Jennifer Commode points out, there weren't many families surviving multiple generations and producing urban dynasties. These short life expectancies meant you often had people remarrying. You would have unconventional family structures, people remarrying, already having children, joining with other families. It wouldn't just be, in many cases, you've joined up partner for life and having one or two children. All this meant, as she says, that there wasn't much long-term structure or stability to social relationships in towns. The fact that you have unconventional family structures, remarrying, early deaths, many people migrating into towns. Now, most people coming to live in towns were from nearby. It varied from place to place, but your typical catchment area might be 10 or 20 miles outside the town. There were a few people living in towns from abroad, particularly for cities with good overseas trading links that would vary greatly. And by far, the majority of the population, of course, was native English. Thinking about what people actually did in these towns, sources suggested that up to a third of freemen, which were workers with the freedom to take their labour where they wanted, who weren't tied to one piece of land, were involved in what's been termed basic necessities, producing subsistence products like food, drink, clothing and building, but it could go up as high as 50% in certain cities. Other people were involved in manufacturing and trade, cloth and metalwork particularly, but there were also people in other areas of work, many servants, many untrained labourers, plus you would get professionals like lawyers and clerks. So yeah, definitely some variety.
There must have been enough economic pull to the city or the town to make it attractive in this, despite being so clearly such a challenging place to live. What do you think that was? What do you think made these places attractive?
I suppose we have focused a lot on the negatives of city living today, smells, insecurity and dangers, but we shouldn't lose sight of their importance. And this is really what was bringing people in. They were vital market hubs for their regions. They would provide a measure of security. You would have the walls there. You would have a bit more security there than you might have elsewhere. They provided opportunities for in economic specialization as well. As you had urban economies moving away from subsistence economics, they gave the opportunity to get certain kinds of employment, to get this security, to trade. This is where your commercial center was, where you would go if you wanted to trade. I think, though, the cultural legacy of medieval cities is deeper than this, deeper than just what brought people there in the short term. It's probably put best by Norman Pounds. The development of cities at this time was really critical to the development of modern civilization. It consolidated important factors in the production of art and culture, literacy, education, trade, politics, and nationalism, bringing people in this kind of cultural melting pot. And that's probably its biggest legacy for the modern day.
Well, thank you, Daniel. That was absolutely fascinating. I really enjoyed that. And I'm really looking forward to the next stage in this series on the overarching development of cities in England. This has been Ye Olde Guide. Thank you for listening. You can find all our episodes at our website, yeoldeguide.com. All episodes are also available on Apple, Spotify, or any podcast provider. We would love it if you could leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. We love reviews and we love ratings, and they help get us up the podcast charts, which is what everyone wants. There is another episode on the ends of towns covering the very beginning, going back pre-Roman, Roman, Saxon, going back to the start, and also check out our many episodes now exploring individual towns and cities across the country, some of which we've mentioned today. You can find all of that at yeoldeguide.com. Thank you for listening.
Thanks.